This is the podcast for Narrate Church. Narrate Church meets every Sunday at 9 and 11 a.m. at the Grand Street Theater in Helena, Montana. For more information, visit www.narratechurch.org.
We're in the fifth part of what is a five-part series called It's About More. It's been a sex series, but only kind of. What we've really been suggesting throughout the series is that sex is about way more than just the physical act. And what we've been saying throughout the series and really been planning on for months prior is that this weekend we were just going to deal as honestly and forthrightly as we knew how to deal with this issue of sexual addiction. And so if you're a guest, it's really important to us that you would know that this is a unique weekend for us, not one that we find any less valuable than any other time, not one that we have worked. I mean, we've worked just as hard on this as we do any other, but just different in the fact that we don't always dig this deep into your personal lives. We don't, I don't know. It's a little tricky because this issue of sexual addiction is very personal and no one likes to talk about it. And so ultimately what I'm saying is if this is your first time to narrate, give us another chance, please, because they're not always this awkward. But welcome nonetheless. My hope for this morning, having said all that, is that no matter where you're at, there's resources that you can take from this weekend. My hope is that whether you yourself struggle with sexual addictions or whether you're a parent or a spouse of someone who struggles with sexual addictions or someone that's not struggled for some time, my hope is ultimately that you'll leave, resourced and a little bit more likely to do well in the future. And if you're someone that struggles, I think we do have some great resources to put in front of you that perhaps you could utilize to get healthy in that regard. If I have one of these this week, which also means I have one of these, but I'm not going to use it for that long because I have ADD and I don't think I'm that talented. But if there's one thing that I would hope that you would take from this weekend, it's this. And that's that there was a time when you had to go looking for pornography. If you're my age or older, I'm 34, you grew up, you were a young adult during that time. There was a time where if you wanted it, you had to go looking for it. But I want to suggest that time is past, that we live in a completely different world. And let me also say, I realized this week that I made the mistake of perhaps unfairly connecting sexual addiction with pornography more specifically. And so I'm aware of the fact that sexual addiction isn't limited to pornography, and yet it does seem like a somewhat safe generalization that most of those issues emanate from what starts with pornography. Nonetheless, the one thing that I'd have for you is that we used to live in a time where you had to go looking for it. Like I had a guy come up to me after the first service and he's like, my story was I went to a Christian school. This is a guy about my age. I went to a Christian school, and so as a seventh grader, what we figured out was that our library had a National Geographic collection. And so he said we identified all the magazines with Aboriginal women in them, and then we earmarked them, and whenever we had a chance to go to the library, we would go to the National Geographic and we would objectify these Aboriginal women. It's supposed to be funny, and you guys are like deadpan serious. And then he said one day we went back to the library and the teachers had found this out and they had cut out all the pictures of the Aboriginal tribes women. Like there was a time, if you're my age or older, where maybe that was your story, where you had to take that mysterious walk down the magazine aisle at the bookstore or maybe at the gas station and you tried to pretend like you were looking for motor oil, but really you were looking out of the corner of your eye and finding out that in fact the little cellophane packet does what it's supposed to do. It covers up the pictures. Or maybe you were a romance novel reader. I'm told that was a pull for some of you. Or perhaps that explains my generation's, especially the gals in my generation, their affinity for the New Kids on the Block, because you kind of had to work hard to go there. Or maybe, you don't have to admit if this is you, but like maybe you had to tear the bra section out of your mom's Montgomery Ward's magazine. Anybody, right? So you're all like, no, I've never done that. And I'm going, you're lying is what you're doing. You typed the magazine before she found out it came in the mail. I mean, those are kind of funny, but not really. But nonetheless, the point is, like, you used to have to go looking for it. And what I want to suggest to you is you don't have to go looking for it anymore. In fact, the exact opposite is true, that if you want to avoid it, you have to put just as much energy forth as that you used to have to put forth to find it. That the whole system has reversed itself, that now it is so prevalent. My first exposure to pornography was in 8th grade. It means I was 14 years old. I was sitting on the back of a bus on the way to a basketball game, and this magazine filtered through, and to be honest with you, I don't know whether I was disinterested because I was embarrassed or disgusted, but nonetheless, I was 14 years old. The other memory that I have was a friend whose dad had 250 channels, and he had Cinemax, and so if you stayed up, if you could keep your eyes open until 2 o'clock in the morning, you might get a 20-second shot of something. The average age that a kid sees pornography today is 10. It's a different world. And so if you're a parent, where I want to challenge you this morning is, like, there's lots of areas where your kids may get lucky. They might end up being really good with their finances, even if you don't talk to them about their finances. They might do well in school, even if you don't engage in their homework. But they're not going to do well here without your intentionality. That's ultimately what I would suggest to you. So let's get into some statistics, and then we'll try to unpack it in another direction. So it's obviously big business. In the U.S. alone, sex is approximately a $15 billion a year industry, pornography. Now, that's a lot of zeros, and most of us will never have that many zeros behind our bank account, and so it's kind of like, 15,000, 15 billion, kind of all the same to me, too many zeros. Think of this, it's Super Bowl Sunday. The NFL is everything today, right? And it seems on a day like today that everybody that you know owns a football shirt. They in some way traffic or spend some money on the NFL. $15 billion is way more than the combined revenue of the NFL, Major League Baseball, the NBA, and the NHL combined. It's a massive, massive business, which is part of why I'm suggesting that the problem has flip-flopped. There are 428 million websites dedicated to pornography. That's a year-old statistic, so it's easy to imagine that it's way more than that. We know that there are 48 million unique users per day. See, you thought you could profile the guy, but you can't, because it's a really, really broad issue. And let me also say this morning's one of those mornings where if you allow yourself to slip into guilt, then really the morning will be of no use to you. And so please understand that our heart as a leadership, our heart as a church, and I'm going to be so bold as to say God's heart for you is not guilt. If you can keep yourself, no matter how you relate to this issue, if you can keep yourself from becoming and feeling guilty, the morning will be a lot more valuable to you. GoDaddy.com registers a new domain every half second. You know GoDaddy.com, right? Because they're known for their very classy commercials at the Super Bowl. The ones that you're like, what? I mean, how do I explain to my kids what Viagra is and what is she doing on this TV? No one else? Man, it's tough. It's a tough crowd. That half-second thing is relevant because of this, because the top uses of the internet are, number one, shopping. You do that at work. Number two, social networking. That too is done at work. Number three is pornography. It's a big deal. 12% of all internet traffic is pornographic in nature. 30% of all data downloads are pornographic in nature. One-third of all unsolicited emails advertise for, solicit, or contain pornography. Here's one that puts it in perspective for me. Every second, $3,075.64 is spent on pornography. Every second, 28,258 people log on to a pornographic website. Every second, 372 people use adult language in a search engine like Google to try to find said website. It's a big business, but it's not a business that's limited to the internet. Ever wonder why the motel that you go to has pay-per-view TV? It's largely because what motel chains have figured out is one of the best sources of revenue is pay-per-view pornography. In 2011, it was revealed that Marriott, to their credit, they've since withdrawn porn sales in their motel rooms, but prior to 2011, they made more money annually on the sale of pornography than they did on the sale of food and alcohol combined. Big business. In the U.S., a new porn film is produced every 39 minutes. While you're sitting in here this morning, that's a couple. It's big business, but it's also not limited to men. Here's where we start getting into some of the urban legends, so to speak. 28% of women, and this would be a very conservative number, 28% of women view pornography at least once a month. So, start counting off 10 and pick which three. Among men, it's 7 out of 10. Women, they say, make up 35% of the internet porn viewership. So they're almost a third of the industry, but they're more than a third of the online traffic. In fact, you businessmen might get a kick out of this one. They make up 35% of the internet viewership, if you will, but only 2% of the profit. So they look, but they don't spend any money. It's a shame issue, we would think. The average child, I already said this, sees porn for the first time at 10 years. Pornography is also one of the fastest growing addictions among the elderly. So, you thought you could profile him. You thought it was that creepy guy. And I think really the most honest response would be to say it's us. That no one here is above it, that no one here isn't susceptible to it. There was a time when you had to go looking for it. That time is no longer. I think you can think of it this way. How many of you own a cell phone? Raise your hand if you own a cell phone. Okay? Or how about a Visa or a Visa check card? Like, why, you might ask, or one question you could ask is, why do you own one? Why do you own a cell phone? Why do you own a Visa card? To which I would suggest, well, our culture, which, by the way, we're not one that goes like, dirty culture. Like, that's not the way we roll, but I think it's relevant this morning. Our culture, they recognize that you're a human being who has communication needs. That for personal reasons, for business reasons, like you need to communicate. The tool they've given you in our culture today is by and large the cell phone. Text messaging, email, calls. If you make calls anymore, you just text, right? I mean, they recognize you have communication needs. Here's the tool. The same could be said of the Visa card or the Visa check card. They recognize that you have you have commerce needs. You have the need to buy things. You have the need to purchase things. You need to get some groceries. You need to put gas in your car. They recognize that. Have you tried to write a check lately? It's like trying to hand them a Chinese dollar bill, right? I mean, or what is cash? See, they recognize you have these needs, and they've given you this tool. I would suggest to you that pornography works in very similar ways. That our culture understands that we as a people understand that we have sexual desires, that we are sexual beings, that we have hormones. And though we might be too embarrassed to talk about them, the culture isn't. And they recognize you have needs and desires and interests, and the tool they're offering is pornography. Now, that's not to use lackey language. I'm not trying to shift the burden of responsibility from myself to them and play the blame game. It's just to say that's the mindset. And to me, it undergirds the level of responsibility that we have as individuals. Like, if you don't want to use a Visa card, that's going to take a lot of intentional energy and a lot of creativity on your part. If you want to get on in life without using a cell phone, that will take a lot of creativity and a lot of intentionality on your part. I'm going to suggest to you that you live in a world that if you want to move forward as an adult sexual being without utilizing pornography, that will take just as much creativity and intentionality. And if you're a parent, it's going to take your help. Again, I think you could get lucky. They might end up being really good with finances even though you never sat them down and showed them how to make a budget. They might end up doing really well in school even though you never helped them with their homework. They might end up having a personal relationship with Jesus even if they never see you engaging him on a personal level in your own life. But after the research that I've done, I couldn't be more convinced that my own kids will not arrive at the other side of high school without a sexual addiction, without my active participation in that with them. It's a big deal. Now, part of the question becomes, why is it such a big deal? Like, what's the big deal? And to be honest with you, I don't want to exert a bunch of energy convincing you that it is, but there is a fantastic video that was made available to us by a doctor who talks about the neurology of sexual addiction, and so I invite you to turn your attention to the screen. It's kind of a long one. It's about 8 minutes long.
Well, the neurology of sexual addictions or sexual obsessions is relatively new. I mean, not new in that it hasn't been around for a while, but a lot of the technology has gotten us to a place where we can really get some nice images of the brain when it's being stimulated. And we've been able to scan brains and be able to see what stimulated brains look like over a long period of time when it comes to addictions and things like that. We're able to understand the neurochemistry, the neurotransmitters that are produced in the brain during times of acting out and that sort of thing. And so some of the stuff that's come out, sort of to give you a shorter Reader's Digest version the neurology of addictions is that there's several transmitters that are really important in addictions. One of them is probably the most important one is dopamine, which is the sort of I gotta have it drug. It gives you the sense of euphoria. People that jump out of planes love dopamine, things like that. And then there's serotonin, which is a mood stabilizer. Most antidepressants act on serotonin, so it helps with mood. And then there's also oxytocin, which is called the cuddle hormone or the attachment hormone, the one that makes you feel a sense of peace when you're feeling connected with someone else and close. And there's also adrenaline that's a part of it too. So you have these four main neurotransmitters that act when you're being sexual. When you're being sexual outside of intimacy, the most dominant neurotransmitter is dopamine. And that's kind of this feeling of, that's part of what takes you away from all the things that you are feeling, because you get this dopamine rush through your body, and a lot of it is in anticipation of the image, and then it's seeing the image, and then it's acting out, and this flood of dopamine. It feels fantastic, and you're not aware of all your sadness, your sorrow, and your life stressors, and all that. And kind of you're almost in this artificial state because of the production of dopamine. And the tricky thing about it is that most addictions are things you inject into your body. You have to go get it, you have to snort it, you have to drink it, you have to do whatever with it. Where sexual addictions, you're your own pharmacy. And so you're using these natural chemicals in your body to be able to stimulate this sense of euphoria. And dopamine has been most closely compared to cocaine. In fact, in scans of the brain, you can see that scans of a coke addict and that of someone who's been addicted to dopamine through addictions looks very similar as far as the way the brain is shaped and the way it looks, and the damage that happens in the brain as a result of that. So it is really as close as you can tell to kind of like this cocaine addiction. Gives very similar feelings to that, but yet produced in the body. Oxytocin is sort of the chemical that's released in the body when we feel a sense of closeness or connection. It's also a huge part of the birthing process for mothers. It's released at huge levels when mothers are giving birth, and it prompts them to reach down and hold their babies close to them, and for their heartbeats to synchronize, and all this sort of beautiful sense of connection. Well, that transmitter is still in the body as adults, and we experience that when we experience intimacy with other people and closeness and sexuality. And so it's also a chemical that kind of tempers our need for dopamine, and gives us a sense of closeness, for instance, following sex and that sort of stuff, as opposed to this sort of dopamine hangover that can happen without the presence of oxytocin as being part of the experience. So addicts will get really addicted to dopamine. And what does dopamine do to the brain? Well, dopamine, it saturates the brain to where the brain has to make adjustments if there's too much dopamine, and neurotransmitter sites end up dying off, or they end up receding from the brain, and so you need more dopamine to feel the same level of excitement, and this is what's called tolerance. And so that's why an addict, one image 2 weeks ago doesn't do the same thing for them today. And so dopamine starts burning the brain out. And I've had people ask, is this reversible? Yeah, absolutely. The brain will adjust and will create new neurotransmitter sites to take on dopamine if we go through times of abstinence. And there's two different, this is also part of treatment. Oftentimes addicts will go through times of either total abstinence, which is typically around 65 to 72 days, or they'll do moderation contracts where they will moderate the amount of sexual contact that they have. So maybe it's like Monday through Sunday they don't have any sort of sexual contact, and then Sundays is sort of the feasting of that. But I've seen success for either one. But the idea is to sort of take in the dopamine in moderation the way it was designed, rather than in these huge doses, which ends up destroying the brain and really ends up creating problems in the prefrontal cortex, which is the most relational part of our brain. It's also the brakes of our brain. And so it has a destructive mechanism in that. I think it's fascinating because you think about it, oh, that's just kind of a pervert or whatever else. When you think about addictions, that's easy to think those things, but not really understand that there's a neuroscience happening behind all of this. And there's these amazing brain scans that show what a brain looks like after it's been exposed to high levels of dopamine that comes through sexual addictions. And it's really destructive. It can really create problems for the brain to be able to operate normally. And again, I think it ends up looking very ADD-like, as the brain is impacted. And the brain is always impacted by the chemicals that are introduced into the brain. So we end up being more, what's kind of called, we end up being more reflexive in that we are more monitored by our amygdala, which is where emotions lie, and we're more driven by our impulses than we are by the front of our brain that slows ourselves down, that gives the information back to the amygdala that says, hey, this is not what you want to do. This is not a good choice. and the capacity to be able to do that begins to be affected as the brain begins to change. But the brain is neuroplasticity, and so it's changing all the time. And so, if you're struggling with addiction and your brain is kind of making this adjustment, and it can be readjusted back to pretty healthy levels. But again, neuroscience is still really at its beginning of understanding the brain, and as it relates to addictions, as it relates to other types of psychological disorders. And so, the next 10 years we're going to know a lot more, and maybe next 10 years we'll be looking at this video and saying, wow, things we know even more now than we knew then, and we can fill in some more gaps. But for now, it's really promising. And there are some suggestions in the field that within 5 or 10 years, all mental health diagnoses will be able to be monitored, evaluated, and confirmed through scanning of the brain, just by looking at the brain and saying this part of the brain's overdeveloped, underdeveloped, and this is where depression lands, this is where anxiety lands. And they're already able to pinpoint where all these things land on the brain, and now it's just understanding it even better. So I think for the addict to understand that it's a rewiring of the brain too. And there's been some stuff that's been out there that suggests that the brain can rewire itself, but some images that are viewed and seem to will always be there, will be stored in this folder in the brain. And as long as it's not being used, as long as the brain's not accessing that folder, then the connections become weaker and weaker, and that the brain can create new neurological connections to the body of responses to images and stuff, which I think is pretty cool. I think sexuality, when it's not paired with intimacy, produces such high levels of dopamine that there's conversation in the field about dopamine hangovers, and these hangovers, can, depending on the person, can last up to 2 weeks, and usually it's this dopamine drop after the dopamine spike, which then has an impact on the other neurochemicals in the body, and the person can end up feeling somewhat depressed or lethargic. And it's sometimes hard to separate, what's actually depression and dopamine hangover and what's just shame from having acted out. And I think that the hangover can contribute to the shame can contribute to the hangover, and I think that's part of the real low that comes. And so what does someone do when they feel that? Well, they got to get out of it. And so there's compulsion to go back to the addiction to get them out of the way that they're feeling, because it's too overwhelming. It feels it's too painful. And so they'll go back to the addiction to numb themselves out with more dopamine, and every time they go back to it, they're further burning the brain out, and creating more neurological problems for them. I think, neurotransmitters are intended to be used in moderation, like most things in life. Moderation seems to be the healthiest. And so you take dopamine and you overdo it, then, your brain's going to be impacted by it, and your moods will be impacted by it, because it's part of regulating mood, dopamine is. And so the serotonin, in and of itself, dopamine, it's a wonderful thing. It gives us energy, gives us motivation, it gives us drive to do things. But when used and overused, it can create real problems for the brain. And with a sexual addict, that's one big problem for them, is the overuse of dopamine.
For those of you that are very technical, and if you're someone that thinks that the Bible and science are in conflict, I submit to you that video. I feel so, I don't know about you, but I feel so privileged to live in a time where we have both the text and the men and the women of the text who've experienced God and said, like, hey, you need to know this, and then to have science coming alongside and going, hey, check this out. And you're going, wow, it's like science and the people of the scriptures are in this awesome dance where they're saying really the same thing from different perspectives. And Paul does that in 1 Corinthians 6, a verse that we've actually looked at in this series, but I think it sounds a little bit differently when you hear that. Paul says to these people known as the Corinthians, flee from sexual immorality. Now, if you're someone that likes intense Bible study at church, this morning will be a letdown to you, because I don't think it takes that many verses to really capture the message and the wisdom of the men and women in the text on this one. Because we have to ask the question when he says flee from sexual immorality, is that prudist? Is it legalistic? Is it quote-unquote conservative? Or is it wise? Is it protective? Does it come from a God who arbitrarily uses his power and authority and says, I'm God, you have to do what I say, and if you're not willing to play that game, then you're not a Christian? Or does it come from a God who says, hey, I use power and authority better than anybody. I use it to serve others. And on this one, you need to know this. Flee from sexual immorality. Now, context is always important, and in this case, I think particularly so, because Paul is writing this to a group of people known as Corinthians. They lived in a city called Corinth, and though Athens gets all the press today, Corinth would have been a real rival city among the Greek Empire. I mean, there's this kind of conversation of which one was more important within the grand scheme of things. Athens had their Parthenon. Corinth had this incredible temple to their own God that we'll talk about in just a moment. The other thing they need to understand about Corinth is that it was Greek, which means it was dualistic. And dualistic philosophy, when you say to someone, oh, they're spiritual, it really originates from their philosophy, because what you're saying there, it comes from Greek, because the Greeks believe that there's spiritual things and there's physical things. That physical things are by their very nature unimportant or bad, that physical things are that, and that spiritual things are by their very nature good, divine. And so the most spiritual people in Greek society were these people, these men and women, mostly men, who would completely separate themselves from the physical aspects of life. This is why some religious traditions celebrate this intense beating of the body, whether that's the denial of food or water, or even in some traditions like actual physical abuse to the body. It's a dualistic belief. A Greek person who took this to the extreme would completely deny themselves sexuality as well, because the physical is all bad. But the way that translates to the everyday Corinthian is that they're like you and I. They're normal people who at some point along their journey have just made a decision to follow Jesus. They were born into a culture that says what you do sexually it's a non-issue. It doesn't matter. It's completely unrelated to your spirituality. See, as much as we say the world is different now than the one you grew up in many ways it's not, because what Paul is saying to them is, hey guys, like what you do sexually, it's connected. It matters. Which is exactly what the doctor is saying. The temple that was in Corinth was a temple to Aphrodite. Aphrodite is the Greek god of love. If you Google Aphrodite and Google image it, be careful. Because even these ancient statues of Aphrodite, they're of very beautiful, bare-chested women. These ancient paintings always involve Aphrodite completely bare-chested, other women completely bare-chested, and then men who are also completely naked but covering themselves just so, and naked children. What those paintings are depicting is Aphrodite worship, which at the temple was where we get the stereotypical temple prostitutes. It came largely from Aphrodite and the worship of her. That at one point, one Greek historian, he says that at any time there were 1,000 different objects, 1,000 different people, whether those are women and or men and or children and or goats and things like that. 1,000 different things, people, animals that you could go to the temple and worship by having sex with them. Aphrodite worship was an orgy. And so Paul is writing to them, see, this is where it's like your story is theirs. He's writing to them going, I understand that everything in your upbringing says, everything in your experience says your spirituality is disconnected from your sexuality. And I'm telling you, it's not. It's just not. And I invite you in your own time to read the remainder of that. But what he says is, hey, you're made for more. You're made for way more. The other thing that I think is worth looking at is the word flee. Like, notice the aggressive nature of his language. It's not be careful. It's not like watch out. It's not like moderation. It's flee. It's a very aggressive, very dramatic word. This summer, I was running, or it was actually this fall, I was running on Mount Helena, and I was on this route, and I came to this place, or I was coming up on this place where I know that I either go right, or I either have to go right or have to go straight. My plan on this particular day was to go straight because I was running a little late to get home. And just as I came up on the intersection, I looked, and about, me to the exit sign on the back of the room was a black bear. So as soon as I saw it, it saw me, it fled. Boom, straight up the side of the hill in the exact opposite direction of me. Well, it was the exact opposite direction because as it went that way, I came across the intersection and I decided I'm going right. Now, I know I'm a little skittish, and if this is home to you, you know I'm kind of a wuss when it comes to these things. But I can assure you, I was rather quickly not afraid for my life. I mean, thing was gone so fast, and I gained a new appreciation for it's a waste of my energy to be afraid of a bear, because if it wants me, it's going to get me, because wow, those things can move fast. And I did the whole cub scan, and I figured out that I wasn't between a mother and her cub, best I could tell, all those different things. So within about 10 seconds, I knew he's going that way. He wants way less to do with me than I want to do with him or her, or whatever it was. And so as I head down that trail, what do you suppose I did? Stop for a drink of water, crawl, walk, or break the land speed record. Yeah, it had very little to do with fear, actually. I just had this logical, yes, I had a flush of adrenaline, but very much my thinking was, well, there's no sense in screwing around here. I might as well just get out of here as fast as I can for as long as I possibly can. Can you agree? Why take a chance? That's the language Paul uses. He just says, flee. None of this hoity-toity soft, it's just get out of there. The biblical example is Joseph. If you're someone that thinks the Bible's boring, then what you need to do is go to Genesis 39 and start there, because there's this remarkable story about a guy named Joseph. And Joseph's story is amazing because it's so tragic, and yet he lives with such integrity. He has these bad things happen to him, and he just keeps staying true to his values. And early on, he gets sold into slavery by his brothers. That's a bummer deal. Gets to Egypt, becomes one of the best workers that his boss has, rises into power as kind of the VP of his boss's little estate there, if you will. And then it becomes clear to him that his boss's wife is trying to seduce him, and she makes some hints, and he shows no interest, and eventually he's out of town, and she catches him in the room, and she tries. And Joseph's response isn't no, let's watch a movie, or no, let's finish the movie, or let's go have a cup of coffee. His response is he runs, to the extent that he runs out the door, allowing her to grab his cloak, and he runs out naked is the assumption. So just imagine yourself running through the office place naked. That's what he's doing. That's the biblical example of this flee idea. Joseph, and I think if you're honest, you go, okay, why did he flee? Did he flee because he was grossed out and he wasn't interested? Well, at least all the men in the room are going to go, not likely. Just not likely. I think he's a guy who understood his own weaknesses and understood that when it comes to sexual temptation, you got two options. Compromise or do something dramatic that involves fleeing. When you're sitting at the computer and the pop-up shows up or the thought occurs to you, you really only have two options. You close the computer and you go do something else, or you go to the website. When you're in the office and the guy or the gal who's not your spouse offers some hints, drops some hints, touches you just so, you really only have two options. You either do something dramatic that forever changes the relationship, or sometime in the not too distant future, you end up in bed together. There's really only a couple options. When you're on Facebook, why are there so many Facebook affairs? It's a failure to flee. You thought you could talk to your high school sweetheart on Facebook and it would have no impact. You thought you could talk to this dude that you knew in college. Turns out you can't. That's what Paul's saying. That's what the doctor is saying. That's what medicine is saying. When you're on a date and his hand goes there, there's only a couple options, isn't there? That you somehow compromise your values or you do something dramatic. Jesus, I think, addresses this as well. I'm aware of the fact that there's been studies done that say that one of the dangers of reading the Gospels is that you read your temperament and personality into Jesus. So if you're an introvert, you see him as an introvert. If you're an extrovert, you see him as an extrovert. If you're kind of a hardcore Christian, go stand on the corner and tell him, you see that in Jesus. If you're kind of softer, indirect, then you see that in Jesus. I realize that's the case, but personally, part of what draws me to Jesus is just how indirect he so often is, and how nondescript his teaching often is. Don't get me wrong, I think he has a clear path for all of us. I think holiness is a real deal, but it's not very black and white very often. If you go looking to Jesus for some rules, you'll be discouraged at how few you find. Love God, love people, it gets pretty vague after that, except on this issue. In Matthew 5, I just was fascinated this week by this realization that Jesus didn't mess around on this one. In Matthew 5, he says, "You've heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So he's saying, I know the goal all along has been, don't sleep with someone that's not your spouse. I'm telling you, the lust is a problem. And if it goes undealt with, it's going to take you out. And then look what he says. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. And some of you are going, see, that's exactly why I can't be a Christian. Like, that is crazy. It is crazy. He is being extreme. It's one of those rare instances where it's like, I'm just not going to mess around. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Notice that he's saying this in the context of sexuality. So modern 21st century science says, flee. Like dopamine, addictive, there will be a hangover, it'll be a cycle. Part of my translation of what I watched there is I'd be better off to go inject heroin and try to quit doing that than I would to go get on one of those websites. Paul says flee, and Jesus says, well, I think you should just cut it off. Like, pun may be intended. But I think Bobbitt tried that and it didn't work out. So nonetheless, it raises the question, like, what do you need to cut off? Like, I don't know if you have some addictive behavior. Maybe you don't either. But I do know that getting well is going to require some extreme moves. Les Parrott, who is himself a psychiatrist and a clinical person, he put together a list of 9 things, and he says if 5 of these 9 things are true of you, then you have a sexual addiction. So I'm just going to read them to us. They're on the notes page too, I believe. From a clinical perspective, porn addiction involves at least 5 of the following: a frequent preoccupation with porn, frequent engagement for a longer period than intended. You sat down to be there for 20 minutes, 3 hours later, you're getting up. Repeated efforts to reduce, control, or stop the behavior. I'm going to quit, I'm going to quit, I'm going to quit. Keep going. A great deal of time spent in activities necessary for viewing porn or recovering from its effects. Number 5, engagement in the behavior when expected to fulfill other obligations. 6, important social, occupational, or recreational activities given up or reduced because of the behavior. Number 7, a continuation of the behavior despite knowledge of having a recurrent social, financial, psychological, or physical problem that is caused or exacerbated by the viewing of porn. So one study I read suggests that impotence is directly related to prolonged pornography. Another says, of course, that marital sexual dissatisfaction is almost always associated with pornography. Number 8, the need to increase the intensity or frequency of the behavior in order to achieve the desired effect. Number 9, restlessness or irritability if unable to engage in the behavior. Maybe you walked in the door this morning not realizing that you're an addict. And I think when it comes to what do you need to cut off, the first question is, do you need to repent? And I understand how the guy on the corner with the megaphone gives the word repent a really bad rap. And it is a gross misrepresentation of what it means. When God invites us to repent, it's not a shame-based tirade that says you are scum, but, oh, you're not because I'm so great. That's not at all the message of repentance. To repent, if you just go back to the original language, what it literally means is to say, my path isn't good, Jesus is better. It's like saying, I used to think that I should go to Harvard, but now I should go to Yale. It's to repent, to switch schools. To repent is to say, I thought I understood life and how it's at its best. I'm admitting that I don't, and trusting that Jesus does. Do you need to confess? In the Bible, confession is never as easy as we often make it on ourselves. Because for us, confession is typically, God, please forgive me, please forgive me, please forgive me, I'm such an idiot. The confession in the Bible rarely looks like that. In the Bible, it's you and God, but it's most certainly you and the person you hurt. If you're married, the confession doesn't just need to go to God, it needs to go to your spouse. If you're a student, the confession doesn't just need to go to God, it needs to go to your parents because you've deceived them. It's always very here and now on the earth practical. And then, seriously, like what do you need to cut off? My friend Fred, who's helped more people than anybody I know, we were talking about this, and he said, Adam, my experience is that if someone has a pornography issue and the issue is their smartphone, they will never get well until they get rid of their smartphone. If the issue is your smartphone, are you willing to figure out how to do life without it? One of my more fond memories of this really neat family in my youth ministry days I remember having this conversation with a dad who just found out that his junior son was looking at porn on the internet, and granted, this was 10 years ago, so it was a little bit different world. And I remember him saying to me, without any drama, he just said, I just said to him, like, we don't have to have a computer in this house. Like, we will figure out how to do life without a computer in this house, so either you knock it off, or there will be no computer in this house. I think that's bold. It's courageous. If the computer's the issue, are you willing to deal with it? If it's an issue at a certain time of day or a certain place or a certain computer, are you willing to deal that dramatically with it? If it's 2 o'clock while you're watching TV because you've got 675 channels, are you willing to deal with the 675 channels? Do you have to have cable? Do you have to have a TV? I know it sounds extreme, but the issue becomes, how bad do you want to get well? That's really the issue. The other piece is there's an organization out there called XXX Church. Sounds weird to say, right? Which is part of the brilliance of their marketing and branding of themselves. It's not pornography. It's an organization, a group of people that have, for over a decade now, they reach out to people who have sexual addictions. They even take their wares to porn trade shows in order to reach out to those people because there's so much shame, and to extend to them, they have T-shirts and graphics that say Jesus loved porn stars all over them. They have a course called X3 Pure. It's a 15-lesson course. I think for some reason I have in my head that it takes 30 days to work through it. There's one for men and there's one for women. It's $100. It might be the best $100 you spend. And though I'm tempted to say, tell me, we'll pay for it if that's the issue, I think the ownership might be really good for you. Like ponying up your own $99 might help you actually take it all the more seriously. Now, if money is the deal breaker, then talk to me. But if you're an addict, maybe you need to sign up for the course. I have a friend who's taking it and says that it is asking questions and making observations that are completely new to him. There's that. And then there's this. If you don't have a problem, how many decisions away are you? I mean, if we're to be honest. If it's been 5 years or, a couple months or maybe never, if you theoretically don't have a problem, how many decisions away are you? One of my favorite things to do with students used to be to take them to San Francisco, and because it's kind of it's a haven for runaway addicts. And so we would stand and watch this 16-year-old girl in line with this 54-year-old guy at a food kitchen. And one of the most fun things to process with those high school students was the only difference between you and that 16-year-old girl is one decision, maybe two. And I think that if we're honest with ourselves, that's true of each and every one of us when it comes to sex and sexuality. And to that end, one of the resources that XXX Church offers that I think is a no-brainer is this thing called X3 Watch. And I invite you to turn your attention to the screen to see a little promo of that.
So surfing the web is great. There's all sorts of fun stuff to do. But sometimes we spend more time on the web than we want, and we end up on sites we don't really think we should be on. Yeah, and even though sometimes we don't want to go, it can feel like it's the internet's goal to send us to questionable sites. Now, as it turns out, we don't always make the best decisions online when we're alone. So we could use a little help. And that's where X3 Watch comes in. X3 Watch is internet accountability software that sends a weekly report of all the questionable sites you've been to, along with the date and time you access them, to an accountability partner. An accountability partner could be your best friend, or your wife, or sibling. People that care about you, people you trust. So now when you're surfing the web, you're not doing it alone. And knowing that someone is actually going to talk to you about what you're looking at may just be the help you need to stop looking at it. Oh, and X3 Watch is free. But if you want some advanced features like an actual site blocker or instant SMS alerts, you can upgrade to X3 Watch Pro. There's also X3 Watch for your smartphone and tablet for a small fee. So you're covered on all your devices. Hey, if you want to be careful about what you see online, don't try it alone. Get started with X3 Watch today.
So just to clarify, it's not a blocker. What it does is you pick people to get an email, and that email tells them, like, here's the sites that this person went to, and it flags them, and so it creates conversations that way. As a parent, after all the research that I've put into this message, I've come to the realization that maybe, unfortunately, I don't know, but it's the best resource I can find to help my kids. I could block something, but then I think I just create a game for them. I just create a puzzle for them to break. But the best thing that I can do, I think, is to put this on our devices and then monitor it and then be willing to cut it off if that's what we have to do. They say that by 2016, the average household will have 19 internet-capable devices in it. So where that gets a little frustrating is like, okay, I got my head around how I can manage the household computer, but the realization is if you've got a kid that's 5 or 6 years old, you know that in the next 5 or 6 years, or by the time they're in high school, they're going to have a smartphone in their hand, and so, geez. So I think ultimately as a parent, you got to pay your fee and figure out, are you going to make it impossible for them, or are you going to make it a conversation with them? I don't know. There's a lot of parents around here that have parented longer than me, and they might be a better resource to you. My bent is I'm going to make it a conversation. The other neat little piece of advice that I heard that may be relevant to you as a parent is they talked about making sure that you put your router in your bedroom so that when you go to bed, you turn it off, which can help as long as your kid doesn't have a cell phone or something like that. So, how do we land this thing? Well, first of all, I would like to suggest it's about more. Like, this isn't just about pornography. As you even look through those addiction lists, you can see that relates to all addictions. And I think ultimately on this issue of sexuality, it becomes an issue of trust. It becomes an issue of, and I don't say this in a shaming way at all, but if you're a Christ follower, you wake up in the morning and what you say is you trust Jesus for your salvation. My question to you is, are you willing to trust him with your sexuality? Are you willing to trust that he knows what he's doing? That he's not trying to keep something good from you, but actually he's trying to give you the best that he has to offer? I remember when I was a newlywed and the 50-something couple that counseled us said that their sex life was better then than it ever had been in their life, I remember thinking, he's a liar. What if it's true? What if it's true? What if inside of marriage is really where it's designed to be? And if you're a married person, same is true. What if everything that's glorified on TV and everything that the media glorifies about multiple sexual partners and all that stuff, what if it's a lie? I could point you to research that says that it is. I think ultimately this is one of those classic issues where we get to express, do we trust that God knows what he's doing or not? Do we trust that he knows what he's doing or not? You know, Jesus says, pray, your kingdom come, your will be done, which speaks first and foremost to you. It's an observation that you and I all have a kingdom. We all have a queendom. And what he's saying is, I've invited you into the kingdom. Are you willing to allow your kingdom and my kingdom to intersect? That what goes on in your domain reflects what would go on in my domain if I was you. He also says, pray, deliver us from evil. And I think if we're honest, there's this stark reminder on this issue that willpower is not going to be enough. I trust that there's non-Christ followers who figure this out. Personally, I can't even begin to imagine how you would navigate this well without his help. If you're someone considering Christ, that's his invitation. To come follow him, to be his disciple, to learn from him how to best live, and to trust that he can empower you to live the very best life, the type of life that no storm can destroy. That's his message. It seems appropriate to finish up this series by giving you a chance to take communion and to worship through song and to really process all that's involved with the forgiveness of sin and what communion's all about. So if you're new to communion, communion is an expression of Jesus' body broken, his blood poured out for you. It's a reminder that we're saved by grace, not because we're good enough for it. I just invite you to perhaps personalize that with regard to your sexuality, to seek forgiveness, to recognize that he's big enough for it, and to acknowledge that you want his way and his life as you move forward. Let me pray, and we'll sing and worship and take communion.
For more information on Narrate Church, visit www.narratechurch.org or download the mobile app, now available for iPhone and Android.